Hey, it's Todd Daniele, and today I'm going to block out a female base mesh within Zbrush. And I'm not doing this to show you techniques, so to speak. What I'm doing it to show you is that sometimes you might want to put aside a few hours and just experiment and not put pressure on yourself to achieve something great. This is more about a learning process, and when you don't put that emphasis on everything being perfect, you may actually come out a better artist by taking chances that you wouldn't if you felt the pressure of making something perfect. So in this video, you'll see that I start out with some rough shapes. I carve them. I do a lot of different things. And I'm never throughout the whole video putting pressure on myself to make a usable asset. This is just a day of practice, so to speak. So I think it's important that we learn to train our eye. So I did use reference. I used Anatomy for Sculptors book, and I did reference visually 3D Scan Store, but I never used transparency in the ZBrush viewport. I felt it was more important to train my eye and know proportions by eye for this exercise. So I never did that. It's not cheating, and it does make your work more accurate, but I think it's good to not forget that without a PC, if you were doing this traditionally, you wouldn't have the ability to like look through the viewport and see the reference behind. So that I think is important. So today's video is really about taking chances, trying techniques you normally don't try, and hopefully achieving something that you can later apply to your workflow. And at the end of this video, I'm going to share the base mesh that I create. It's pretty decent. Polygon count is good. It's not perfectly laid out loops. I used a remesher to make the mesh. It does have polygroups, but it's a good base to start a sculpt, and it's easily posable because of the polygroup. So I think, well, let's just get into the video. So I used some basic shapes, melted them together, and used the knife tool to like carve them and make some planes. Put a simple sphere on top, pull out the jaw, use the primitive to make some legs, and I'm just melting this stuff together with Dynamesh and trying to get a rhythm and a sort of basic shape. And not traditionally how I would dual block out, but I thought it was just a fun way to try. And again, I had no pressure this way. I made some planar surfaces using like polish, inserting more primitives, primitive for the arms, and just getting the overall feel. And you can see it's not very good, right? So even the hands are pretty basic. The feet are a little off, but I'm just getting the basic shapes. And that was relatively quick. I probably did that in real time in maybe 10 minutes. And then I just started to polish things to change the transitions, make them a little smoother, and just work the mesh. So I'm going to let it go for a little bit, and if anything major happens, I'll comment. Just adjusting silhouettes a little. Blocking in some mass with the clay brush. Okay, this is the second session. Doing some tweaking. A lot of masking going on. I do think if you isolate a section and work on just that section, it's kind of helpful. And also for subtle shapes, it's really helpful to use masking. Blocking in some shapes. You can see I'm not being like overly cautious with these. I'm being a little heavy-handed. Carving. I think you need to also concentrate on adding and subtracting. Here I'm just adding in primitives, stretching them to fit the areas I want, and sort of reinforcing the forms with these big, perfect shapes. Like more reinforcement with primitives. You can see I'm building up some nice shapes, and then later I can refine those. So it's kind of easy to create volume that way. Just again reinforcing and making more stable or more firm those shapes. Okay, now I had remeshed this, polygroup the arms so that I could isolate the torso and not have the arms obstructing, and I'm just working on silhouette. Pretty much the rhythm and shapes of the body. Again, I'm tweaking things with masking. Arms are getting tweaked. I'm checking all views to see if the shapes look good from multiple directions. Carving, building. A lot of times I'm destroying detail. I mean, that's just something that even I will get better at as I go, even after all this time sculpting. So sometimes it's hard to restrain yourself when you're in the moment. You can see the lower leg's a little wobbly, so I'm going to probably do a little refinement, which I did. And next session, I started working on the scapula, the ribs, clavicles. You don't need to know all the names. I don't know all the names, but the parts I do, I'll say. And then I'm just carving, adjusting proportions. I'm referring a lot to my Anatomy for Sculptors book, which I recommend getting if you don't have it. It's a great book. Just blocking in shapes with the masking to make it softer, some volumes, and just really trying to get the rhythm and the shapes to a good place. And each session, each time it ends and a new session begins, you can see I'm refining and I'm going at it with a fresh eye, and it makes it easier for me to see what I need to do next. That was just some muscle groups, kneecaps. Those are all with clay or clay tubes brush, and I changed the value. What I will say too is I discovered during this project is if you go into the brush menu under the light box, that there's a smooth stronger, and with a moderate poly count you can really develop some great planes. In some of these videos you'll see that I start to like really wipe at the mesh with a smoothing brush, and I got like these plainer sort of faceting stylized looks, and I do like that, but I didn't think that's where I wanted to stop. I'm just simply pulling out some ears, adjusting proportions and rhythm with a base mesh, carving in some detail, and there you go. You can see some of these like really strong separations. That's with the smooth stronger brush, and it works well. I think it'll force you to sculpt better because you'll have planes in place. Growing the mesh to do some adjustments. I find that isolating parts and looking at reference is a good way to like not get overwhelmed. Masking and just like doing overlapping areas. Adjusting the shape of the calves. I looked at reference and discovered they needed a little work. A basic sort of skull block out, not really worrying about the facial forms. Reinforcement of all these volumes, they need to be sort of round but flat in spots, so it's important to remember like round areas, flat areas, and have them interact a little bit. The feet, start like blocking them out, making them more primitive so I can then cut in detail. Some volume to the arms. Here I cut up the mesh into sections just so that I could dynamesh each section and work on them, and I melted them back together really quickly in the beginning of the video. You'll see lines at the beginning of that section of video where I have them separated, and I worked each section and then melted them back together. Adjusting proportions, using masking an awful lot, and I think it's important to use. Carving in some details with Damn Standard. And that area there between the breast and the armpit, I always have an issue, so I went overboard, but it looked good. It actually forced me to do something I'm not really good at doing, and I got it to work, I think. I felt like I did. Revealing the mesh and cutting in some neck detail. Again, making planes where I need some planar breaks. I think it looks cool right now, very stylized. I think my end mesh looks cool, but not as good as this. I like the stylized version better, but it wasn't something that I was being precious with, so I'm not upset that I destroyed some of that detail. I actually like it, so. Fat pads, that's something that's outlined in Anatomy for Sculptors where fat would gather, so I'm using the mask to get some nice shapes and then blending them in. Working on the knee, I have a lot of issues with those areas that I'm working on right now usually, so I thought I'd just try to get them a little better. Softening things together. And again, reinforcing forms. Slight adjustments to shoulder width. Down to the ankle where the tendon ties in. I usually have a little issue getting that to look the way I want. Reinforcing the forms around the knee. So I'm using the dam standard or an equivalent brush to make a planar change. I'm carving and building two sections and then wipe them together so that they have like this little stepping kind of thing. Some secondary detail. More work on the feet. I never do the toes, I think, in this one, but it's good enough because you're usually going to put a boot or a shoe on anyway, so. Some back. And I've been doing these little adjustments on a layer, and then I can always dial them back. So that's a good thing to do, is like make a layer where I'm just working on the back, overdo it a little bit, roll it back on the intensity of the layer, and then have something that I can work with. I'm adjusting knee position. I didn't like the position of the knee. Some volume to the calf. And looking at every angle to try to make sure I have clean lines. You know, no wobble or nothing that doesn't look proper. Made some planar changes on the ribs. Melted the side of the breast into the side of the ribs where the serratus are. Polygrouped, and I made a copy of the mesh, polygrouped it, and made the hand out of that copy and deleted the rest. And quickly I'm going to block out fingers. And I did that really because I was going to share the mesh. I would have probably stopped before this, but I was just like, well, I'm going to share it. Let's give a full mesh. And you can see I just refine it, not to like super perfect, but good enough that someone can take it and use it as a base. I think later on when I remesh it again, I also polygroup the fingers. I just did to get the silhouettes of the fingers. That's what I'm doing here. But in the final mesh, I also polygroup that. So you can see I started with primitives and in several sessions, just kept going. So here's more towards the end of the process. I'm breaking this into polygroups, is why we're seeing pieces disappear. So those are all polygrouped in the mesh that I'm giving away. I added a ponytail and a little hair that's up. You can delete that if you use the mesh. And that's probably like a 35,000, I think it says, for the poly count. I think this is a good base mesh for someone to take and make something else out of. So that's pretty much the block out of that base. We're going to see a little turntable now. I'm going to say, if you like the video, like and subscribe. Please subscribe. You can buy me a coffee. There's a link below if you want to buy me a coffee and you found this helpful. And of course, there's a free base mesh. Thanks so much. I'm Todd Daniele. I'll see you in the next video.